So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mikkel Svendsen. About one console generation ago, I worked on lighting, water effects, and the spoiler on play that's inside with my colleague down there. And I even had the honor of doing a couple of talks on it. So today, I'm going to talk to you about our game Cocoon, which I'm going to talk about some, lighting, water effects, and even warp into some orbs. Silence your phones, housekeeping, and so weiter. So, Cocoon's development began with Jeppe Carlsen in 2017, when together with fellow Plated alumni Jacob Schmidt, they formed Geometric Interactive. Early on, they met our talented art director Erwin Koh, who was brought on to solve some of the visual mysteries of the game's cosmic journey. Then, late 2018, I joined with my nerd graphics to find some of the technical solutions to the puzzles in the production. Now, years later, working with the talented team of designers, artists, and engineers, it was released, and it looks a little something like this. Normally, this is where I would cut from the opening shot of our reveal trailer and show you my PowerPoint slides. But I'm going to do something a little different. So instead of advancing slides, we'll just zoom out. All right. So here in this canyon where the game begins is probably the perfect place to show you some lighting. And awkward silence. There we go. So the indirect lighting is a baked light probe or volumetric light map or whatever you want to call spherical harmonic irradiance stored in voxel textures. This is what they look like by themselves. And the game was shipped on Unity 2020 LTS using URP 10, and our indirect lighting replaces the various global illumination systems found within that engine. Before implementing our custom light baker, the game looked like this. So at this point, it was just two directional lights stored in a uniform spherical harmonic. Now, we didn't want to use light maps because of the lack of support for like transparent particles or animated skin meshes, but we still wanted higher fidelity than just the spatially uniform directional ambient lighting that we would otherwise get. So in our spherical harmonics, we store irradiance, which is a fancy word for light that can be seen from a given point, I think. And then this is then turned into radiance by materials. Well, the other way around. Anyway, so this is another fancy way of saying materials show the light they saw bounce off of them. And our spherical harmonics are first order, meaning that they are two bands, one ambient component and one or three directional components. We tried second order, but it showed diminishing returns on our mostly diffuse surfaces throughout the game. Each of our four components are full signed HDR color, which is a lot. During light baking, this is then stored at half precision floating point numbers, which adds up to 192 bits per voxel, which is a bit. So luckily, lighting is always positive, so at least the ambient non-directional part can be stored and compressed as BC6H, which is a hardware texture compression for HDR color textures, saving 40 bits and gets us down to 152 bits per voxel. So, however, directions are signed, and while BC6H kind of supports it sometimes, not in this, we can remove said sign by adding the ambient part to the directional part and then use BC6H as well for the directional components. This gets us down to 32 bits per voxel, and it looks like this. It's quite JPEG-y, and that's still a lot of data. So, which is why we went with another hardware compression technique, BC1, which we can do if we could get rid of the floating data range. So we can do that by simply dividing the directional data by the ambient data, so we get the maximum component sort of clamped out to the range. So, making it normalized as we store it, and then multiplying it back once we've sampled it. And that looks like this. So this is quite nice. We've gotten rid of the JPEG artifacts, basically, and we're now down to just 24 bits per voxel. Anyway, another reason that we use voxels is to avoid parameterizing our meshes, as we don't want to use lightmap UVs. They're annoying. So, but much like light maps, we do use charts and atlases. So out here we have one chart. This is one of them. It's just a bounding volume around a particular subscene. And then each of these charts is then stored in a larger atlas composed of multiple subscenes that make up a given world, which looks like this. And to make these charts, we need, of course, some kind of ray tracing, I guess. But I didn't want to implement and maintain APIs like DXR or optics. Luckily, we already kind of have a ray tracer in the form of a rasterizer, you could say, because rasterization, if you think about it, is really just ray tracing a grid of rays that either share a origin point in the perspective case or share a direction in the isometric case, which is kind of neat. So to bake a ray for our chart, we just render out an isometric camera with a texture 2D array. And then the view and projection matrices are simply defined by our chart's transform and bounding volume. Oh, I got ahead of myself. There we go. And then we just have to render out the same number of instances as we have slices. There we go. And then in our vertex shader, we just have to set the slice ID to the instance ID and add that to the set position so that we render each slice beginning at that plane. Now, to control the direction, we need this thing called a ray matrix, original name, and it also has support for an offset we can add, as well as a near and far clip plane as well. Now, so during bake, when we generate a ray direction, a jitter offset, and a single voxel knee plane offset, we then use this matrix to get multiplied as the last action in our vertex shader, and that's it. So instead of maintaining DXR or metapasses, we just include this macro in the vertex program to be compatible with the baker. All we need is this macro, and it's kind of simple to maintain that way, basically. Anyway, finally, a couple of details. So we add a little bit of extra vertex occlusion to help with crevices and such. If you look like right down there, there's kind of something missing now. Now it's good. So it's simply achieved with regular physics rays across triangles that are happening during bake time, and then they're just weighted barycentrically to each thing. But importantly, they're then composed together with the spherical harmonic products of the voxel grid using, well, a spherical harmonic product, which I think is a neat function. Anyway, so this little extra detail means we can lower our resolution of our voxels, getting away with this, and it also means that it can be painted manually, that vertex occlusion, so it gives our artist a way to like just, you know, reduce the ambient part where need be for whatever reason. Anyway, let's shift gears. I included water breaks in the presentation. What's that about? All right, so we're out here. That guy will become relevant later. That is a lot more relevant now. Righto. So we now just jumped out of the world contained within inside this very bright and ponderable orb. It's a bit of a torch to light the way in our adventure. Naturally, of course, it has a point light, but it's a point light with a couple of tricks up its sleeve. So let me remove that for the time being. Turn it off so we can build it up. Now, let's actually start with the sunlight's contribution because, you know, that's kind of the first thing that you notice, and we're going to need to zoom in a little bit to tell what's going on. There we go. All right, so of course the orb has to cast shadows. Boom, that's kind of self-explanatory. The only trick here is that we only cast shadows with the back face so that the interior remains lit by the sunlight. And then, of course, the diorama can shadow no problem, there's nothing there. Now, the point light, it needs shadows too. Boom, quite simple. And this is just a pre-baked shadow cube map that's saved to an asset, no real-time point shadows needed, but of course this is kind of missing some of the shadows we want, so let's turn around to look at some feet. Anyway, so because we still want our characters to cast some shadows, so, you know, here's some fake shadows, they're kind of hard to see those, so let's turn off the sun for a hot second, there we go, and try again. There we go, so that's nice and grounded. Now, this is clear, so this is just our take on capsule shadows. It's just two lines going from the head to each toe, and then added with a bit of thickness and a bit of feathering as well. And that's what that looks like. So we project these lines from the light to the ground, and then get the distance to these lines on the projected ground, and then we add this fake feather blur. It looks better than the shadow mask that we had before, and I don't really think I need to sell the joy of a good capsule shadow to anybody. Anyway. So now the mist within that orb there, it's kind of a noisy height and depth fog to make the interior just sort of filled out entirely. So let's remove that and build that back up again. There we go, zoom in, and now it's gone. And here, so the depth fog, the height fog is just to like sink the bottom of the diorama into it so you can't really see where it starts and sort of hide that, well, it's not endless, in fact. And then the depth fog is just to make sure that it's all uniformly opaque because, in fact, this is not a transparent orb. That's fake. And then, of course, we have just some noise to like give it a little bit of texture that moves around as you move around. And to sample this thing, it's just a matter of sampling it in n steps. And of course, because the step length is variable, you need to take your alpha to the power of the step length to, you know, compensate for that density difference that would otherwise be there. Anyway, finally, let's talk about the reflective glass of that thing. We're going to need to wait for the guy to walk on screen again because I've been real cute with these videos. There he is. Now, as you know, let's zoom in and remove it. All right, now there's no glass. It looks a lot more contrasty and a little too harsh. So let's put it back in. Now, the first step is just like a regular specular highlight on top that just lets you know which way the sun is coming from, or other orbs for that matter. It's just the regular specular light function, nothing to it. Then there's this little Fresnel glow at the bottom to just reduce the contrast of the thing and make it look a little bit more, I guess, uniform. These contributions add about that. But then we have this fake screen space reflection kind of thing. So basically the way that this works is just by warping the environment from the edge coordinate in over itself, because we had regular, like real screen space reflections at some point, but the artifacts, I mean, are annoying, and I mean, this looked better, frankly, so fake screen space is better than real screen space. Anyway, so this is the entire contribution of that class, and this is then all these things put together. I think it's just kind of neat that these like little emissive things do a little reflection there. That's all I'm trying to say. Anyway, all these bits of the orb makes it fit into the environment, even though it's mostly just a glowing sphere. Despite its emissiveness, I think you notice when it's being affected by the environment in the way that you expect it to be. Now, so that world within that world, as we charge up the orb, it fogs up, opens up, and we jump in. The good part. All right, so let's go back out. And now let's break that down. So, rendering the world within a world is, you probably guessed this, an inner camera and an outer camera, which is then composed with a mask that is the orb. But that's unsavory. We should probably do something about that. So we have a few ways to optimize that. So for the inner camera, there is a lot going on in there. So at normal zoom levels, the density of the level is fine, but out here, this is quite a lot, so we can do a lot better. Since we can't see the orb's edges, we can simply adjust our culling matrix to get rid of anything that's outside that periphery. There we go. And since we don't need to see these pixels anyway, we can just scissor crop them as well, which is quite neat. And since we can't see past the orb's circular boundary either, we can just set anything out there to the near depth of the camera to avoid shading any of these pixels. And now we have a tight crop. Boom. Now, for the outer camera, nothing draws behind the orb thanks to just a depth prepass. So now we have no double rendering. And this lets us get away with two cameras who are rendering to the same background MSAA texture with only a single resolve. So we don't do any resolve between these steps, which is kind of nice. Anyway. And that's most of the performance hygiene behind how warps are able to work, but there's just a couple more tricks. So let's just, there we go. All right, so the player is rendered in both of these cameras, and that's simply just done by like teleporting the player between the two cameras with a relative transform between the two matrices, and that's it, instead of like having two players be skinned or something like that. Maybe a little over-optimized, but anyway. Now, normally we would need a lot of shadow texels and shadow draw calls, especially on the other side in that camera. We don't really want to do shadows for both cameras. That would be annoying. So what we have instead is a static shadow map that's just like global for the whole world, unchanging, and this is compressed as BC4 because you can compress shadows with BC4. It's quite nice. Anyway, and as you zoom out, as we zoom in, we see this fisheye effect, which would look like this without, and here it is with. So it's not just for looks though, it's also, you probably noticed, a lot of those pixels just got cropped out. So the nice thing about this is that before the fisheye effect, we can simply crop in with a scissor rect to where the fisheye is going to warp it out to, and thereby reducing our total needed fragment cost for the screen. You don't notice that it's cropping because it's been fisheyed. Anyway, so to speed up the depth prepass, final little bit, we actually use 16-bit depth for the game, which some platforms thought was nice. But of course, that would mean that we get quite crunchy depth. So of course, we move the near clip plane in quite a bit when we're at these zoom distances for the inner camera. And this near plane fix is not just for the prepass depth or fragment depth, it's also for our fog resolution to be improved as well. Speaking of, this is my favorite segue. Fog. So the fog is a single scattering Voxel solution. It has a resolution of 120 by 64 by 256. Each voxel contains the color and alpha of the fog at that given spot. Each fragment is simply shaded with a simplified version of what you would find in a typical, fragment material shader throughout the game, but optimized. And then it's pre-integrated using a simple compute shader like this. And this means that any opaque or transparent shader that wants to sample this thing just has to sample the pre-integrated texture once, and it works with MSAA and transparencies and whatnot. It's quite nice. Anyway, it also receives the baked voxel lighting from the environment so that it fits in nicely and it's shadowed in shadowed places and so on and so forth. It's one of the benefits of voxel ambient lighting. This is what it would look like if it's just using an ambient color pick color that's sort of close to it, but not really. This may be pedantry, but it'll be less pedantry later. Anyway, now let's open this door because, I mean, really the thing we care about by having fog is to be able to do shadowed sunlight, right? That's why people implement it. Right. So sampling the shadows without any temporal or spatial filtering, which the game does not use any of, would produce quite a bit of aliasing and flickery stuff right there. So what we do to get rid of this is, of course, use a mipmap texture of the shadows. That's just a nearest filtered shadow mipmap right there, not using DSM or MSM. And then to pick the correct mipmap, we not only use the fragment DDX and DDY partial derivatives, but also an analytical DD set derivative generated just mathematically from the froxel buffer's positional gradient. Now, anyway, across the bridge we find some of these crystals. We'll get back to those later. But as I'm a big fan of fog, I'm going to use my slowest slide for whatever technical reason to try to disable and enable the voxel lighting on the voxel fog once more time. Let's see if that works. Now it's gone. It's a bit more gray. Bad. Shouldn't be like that. Anyway, so flying into the clouds, we get this cool crane here, and the fog also animates up in intensity as we get it below us. So one more time, I'm just going to iterate on the fog color thing because it's here's the good part to show it, I think. So back there, now I've disabled it. You get this like bright distance fog effect that you would otherwise get if you don't, sample the correct ambient lighting. And now you get nice self-shadowing in there, which you expect. Anyway, so the volumes are modeled. The fog is modeled. So they're defined by these box transforms. So let's zoom out to show one of those. That's that one in particular. And each of these volumes can, of course, be animated in each way and put wherever you want them. Here's how this one's density was animated upwards as you came up into the clouds. You can pick your favorite color. You can add your favorite amount of turbulence. And this turbulence noise is just a 3D texture whose mipmap is also chosen by those DDX, DDY, and analytical set derivative as well. Now, as this is a localized fog solution, and that is kind of the neat trick here, we need to voxelize these fog bounding volumes somehow. So, as you know, I'm a big fan of rasterizer abuse. So on top of being an excellent ray tracer, the voxelizer is also a great, the rasterizer is also a great voxelizer, I think. So to do it as such, while rendering the layer buffer, what we want to do is render out our boxes as cross sections that are instanced quads, basically, for each layer. Then, like our lighting rasterizer ray tracer thing, we just set the slice ID to be the instance ID, and then that draws them full screen. Now, to only draw the sides of the box, what we do is we trace a line of a given vertex, from the back to the front of the box of a given plane slice and intersect where that line would hit that plane slice to get the sides of the box fitted. So this maps the left, right, top, and bottom sides of the box to only draw within the lines. And then to get the back and the front of the box, what we use is that the rasterizer just has a near and far plane clipper, and we abuse that just by outputting the set position as the t value of that line trace, which is quite a neat thing. That's just a thing. If you don't disable set clip, that at least works. Anyway, so this method of rasterizing the fog this way only generates fragment threads where they're actually needed, which is neat, and we get to use native hardware blending for blending multiple modeled boxes of fog together that way, which is also nice. Anyway, so that's sort of our base rendering out of the way. Let's shift gears a little bit and look at some visual effects type stuff instead. So after each world, you gain a new ability and your orb takes on a second role. Well, at least if you have beaten the boss, but we're skipping that for spoiler reasons. Not that this video totally spoils the whole game, just not the gameplay. Now, from the orb, an asteroid belt appears, and within its orbit is this crystalline bridge, and it's not the first time we've seen this. Through the gate and over the bridge, you saw the deposits of this stuff scattered throughout the world. And out here, the orb is what reveals it. So within these structures, you see the structure made up of these cellular crystals, which are made using a volumetric Voronoi map of sorts. It's done using a regular point grid, which is then made irregular with these little random orbits. And then we can, of course, find our current cell and intersect our next cell. And then we can shade this just like the opaque interior and the transparent exterior, and mixing them together with a little bit of refraction in between. But it's quite colorless, this thing. So to add some color to this broken tempered stained glass thing, we just add this fake irradiance texture on top of it that's sampled using the Lambert and the Fresnel coordinate, you could say, to, I guess, be the texture coordinates of this texture. Yeah. And since we light it up using the regular shading function, it fits into various environments. You know, it reflects, that's nice, and it casts shadows, that's neat as well. Now, for the actual reveal of these bridges, this is done, you could have probably guessed this, using an alpha dissolve. So it's an alpha dissolve driven by the asteroid belt, which is then quantized to be per crystal. It's done to sample the alpha value. We just intersect the orbital plane, get the orbital distance, smooth step the range to the orbital radius, and then we quantize the input position to be the crystal center, basically. And that's our first orb, basically. So this trick of rendering interior geometry as an effect on geometry is something we enjoy using quite a bit. It's used liberally on various emissive effects and such throughout the game. This was just a procedural example of that kind of trick. Now, the second orb. So, this world has this weird boggish water to it that I've now removed, now it's back, which adds a reflection and refraction effect to the entire image. And it's got this murky stuff going for it as well, which is just a bright fog volume that's just layered just above the water surface, and a dark fog volume layered just below the water surface. Now, the water surface starts with a blur refraction effect made from your standard grab or opaque pass thing, which works natively on the fog since it was just applied in the opaque pass before it was even grabbed. So this is what the refraction looks like without any fog. And here it is with. I just think it's a neat trick that like the water itself doesn't have any like bespoke water fog. It's just the model fog boxes that the game already has. Anyway, now for the actual normals that do this refraction, they got a little cute trick because I wanted to do something to indicate the shore and like ground the water to the environment in some way, but I didn't want like foam waves or anything like that. So instead, around the edge we have these sort of ripples coming out of there, and they are generated by a nearest shore vector like that, with a sign of distance, faded over distance, and then on top of our shore direction. So this vector itself is an RGB texture. It's using red and green for direction and blue for the distance, which is generated and compressed offline using a tool. It renders the scene from above using a geometry shader. It generates quads at each triangle intersection. Then each quad renders out the distance and direction to the intersected segment there. We then combine this with just two scrolling normals, which are then offset or pushed out with the SDF direction, which creates this anisotropic stretching, and it slows down the scrolling of the normals closer to the shore, which is kind of neat. And then this is just, added on top of the ripples, which is like that. So this combination of procedural ripples on top of textured normals gives a nice mix, I think, especially with the stretching. To be honest, the stretching itself adds most of it on its own, I think. The sine ripples were just kind of for free, I guess, unless you really hate sine waves. Anyway, naturally we have planar reflections, and they're pretty normal. They're just like a low-res planar reflection, but using MSAA to fix the otherwise low-resolution coarse image quality. And like our warps, in the water we only use static shadows. And speaking of warps, we gotta avoid this dude here. There. Now, this diorama here is, of course, also a planar reflection. It's made for each portal, giving you a preview of what's inside of it. To flatten it, it has a green skybox, as well as a green light and some green fog. Here it is without those things. The light just maintains some contrast, and the fog just sort of like, you know, fades it out a little bit, makes it a little more, less like something you think you can jump into, I guess. Anyway, much like warps and reflections, they use finer culling to not render all the objects, and the same scissor rect, and of course the same depth punching effect to make sure we don't do any fragments we don't need, which is neat. So this effect was practically invented just for this puzzle. Now, I think that was the only puzzle spoiler in this whole talk. Now let's walk through this another door over here. Wonder what these things are. That'll become relevant later. Now, I'm going to quickly touch on just the specular sunlight on top of the water. So instead of a skybox sun, we use just an analytical specular light that you would find in any other shader function. There it is without, and it's going to appear in that left corner down there. Boom. So the only trick that this has going for it is that instead of shadowing it with the cascaded shadow map, it is shadowed with the depth buffer of the reflection compared with the far clip plane, which was just to make it match up a little bit and not do the whole shadow transform thing. It was a small optimization, kind of cute. Anyway, ominously out here it started to rain, if the compression let us see that. Now, rippling out on the surface, it's quite subtle, but the compression has definitely eaten it up, so that's fine, we can accentuate it. So the ripples on the ground are done using something similar to the shore ripples. It's a Voronoi diagram textured dubbed rain map. Whose distance can be animated over sine, turned into normals with a vector, and randomized with an index. Much like the shore texture, it has direction in red and green, the distance in blue, and then the randomized index is just sitting in the alpha channel. I thought it was just kind of fun that the crystalline bridges Voronoi diagram and the shore map of the water came together for the rain effect in some way. Now, that boss over there looks real interesting, but if you haven't noticed, we're skipping the bosses for good reason. All right, now we have a second orb ability up there, and this one is a bit of a reversal of the last, as instead of revealing bridges, this one is kind of a vanishing trick on these columns of sorts, so that we can ascend, like so. Now, when cloaked, the solid volumes turn into this transparent effect, which we can walk in and out of. And much like the cellular crystalline bridges, we've seen these things before. So just past the gate, we saw them out here in this wet world here. But in here, the shading is done in a similar way to the orbs. So it's a ray march effect of sorts, but instead of ray marching through a sphere, we're ray marching through the bounding box of the columns. Plus a little bit of margin so that we can safely add some distortion without killing anyone. Now, the shading is slightly simplified, boasting non-directional indirect lighting, as well as just hard shadows to just save on sampling costs when we are iterating, and local lights for the orb, so that the orb also heavily lights it up from within, of course. As usual, I'm a big fan of visual effects that use the proper lighting, so that they, we're using forward rendering, so why not? The indirect lighting makes it fit nicely into crevices, and the sun lighting makes it fit nicely into these outdoor scenarios as well. Anyway, back on track, and one final point about the transition between the opaque and the transparent part of it. So let's go up and then go down and peel back some layers. Boop. All right. Here it is without. And then the first thing is, of course, the actual misty volume, which looks like this. That's just faded in with a smooth step height, nothing else there. And then comes the clip plane of the actual opaque geometry. So this is just clipped using a regular clip distance on the column. And then to sort of hide this intersection here, we fade on top of it with the same clip, a emissive surface on top. And then on the other side of that fade, we render an actual transparent version of the same thing using the inverted clip. The clip is matching so that the raster positions of the depth rights are matching and we don't get any weird discontinuancies. And that's basically how that works. So the clip plane was just a nice way to like fade between an opaque and a transparent thing without doing something the hardware doesn't like. I have not found any hardware that cares that I have a clip plane in the shader as long as it's not actively in use by intersecting any geometry, unlike something like clip or discard or coverage, which the rasterizer does care about. Anyway, that's it. It's time for our third orb. So, in this alien world covered in translucent skin membranes, it's all about refraction effects. So, beneath its fleshy surface, we can see some organic weird interiors. The exterior is quite simple, just has some normal maps and some bioluminescent emissive stuff going for it, but it's the interior part that's important. So, it's partially using an opaque grab pass when we need to see the player inside of it. But when we want to see the player on top of it, to avoid occlusion and disocclusion artifacts, we use an off-screen texture which we render some interior bits into. So the refraction is similar to the water. Here you see the off-screen texture in the black parts of the image. And then we add some normal map distortion and some directional blur to mask the bilinear filtering that you would otherwise notice with the undersampled effect. Now, the off-screen texture is rendered at a lower resolution, about half res, I think, while the grab texture is actually just downsampled to half res from full res. Anyway, we'll trip down the cave. This will not be our last elevator. And down here is one of the few places with no sunlight. So there's just this big glow from the center where we find the transporter. And as you can see, we have these organic interiors on the membranes as well, and they're even lit up. And the way that they're lit up is much like the orb, just by only casting shadows off the back face instead of the front face so that the light can escape into the interiors as well. And these platforms are walkable, hence why it's important that they were using not the grab texture, because then you would see when the player walks across it that it looks weird. Anyway, now I know we just took a lift, but this one's cooler. And it's a good water break too. All right, so we're out of the cave and back on the surface, and cross another door. What's this? So foreshadowing another orb's ability are, well, a bunch of orbs. So I want to talk about one more little pedantic refraction thing. So here we have these things with this, kind of foggy stuff inside the interior. It's of course done using a depth range of sorts that we're sampling, which is then used as a mask to blend the fog color. Now, when you sample a coarse or undersampled or min-max downsampled depth with bilinear filtering, if you're just getting a binary mask, it's as simple as using a sampler comparison state to make sure that you get correct filtering and don't introduce aliasing in weird ways. However, if you want a smooth gradient, you would typically sample this with bilinear sampling and then do inverse lerp or smooth step or whatever to create the effect that you want. But this will create these weird hard edges around things that you don't really desire. So the trick, of course, is to use gather operations instead, and then interpolate the samples after you've done your operation to each sample, which might include a clamping, for example. So this smooth PCF comparison tool has come in handy numerous times to just fix little weird aliasing artifacts. So here's one example. Really squint underneath that thing there. So we use depth masks in the game to ground reflections and refractions and all sorts of things. And we do indeed smooth step before the interpolation, and that looks like that. So that fixes those weird artifacts that we would otherwise be dealing with. And the same thing goes for refraction, and yes, it shows up on this LED wall. So same deal goes for the refraction. It helps with grounding and masking without using the what's it called, gather-based trick. We would get these weird fringes around objects that come because it's an MSAA rendered game, of course. And with the PCF trick, we get rid of most of that stuff, which is nice. Anyway, I just think this is a game where MSAAs are only anti-aliasing, so it's important to not introduce any weird aliasing with depth sampling effects. So now for this Orbs ability. The world is full of these eggs now, which contain our orb. They all seem to. And this was indeed what was foreshadowed in the previous world. So back outside and around here, we see these weird stacks of creatures here. Now, affectionately, our speedrunners call these guys Blorbo, but canonically their name is Orb Grabber, which is fine because there's lots of eggs around. We can get it back. Now, if I hadn't skipped this bit, this is where we would have seen these foreshadowed earlier. You'd see them foreshadowed just before the door. Now, this organic thief has a mechanical cousin. They're part of a weird cryptomanic family that just really loves stealing your stuff. Pure property theft. Anyway, it's encased our key in amber, but we can still see inside it a little bit. So, this interior is using the same sort of off-screen refraction texture as the other stuff in the other world. But instead of a flat depth-based fog, inside we find a point-based volume light which spills into the surroundings. And this one is a remarched effect using a sphere volume, and it has two parts. Of course, it's got the cookie texture, naturally, as well as the inverse squared fall-off. And marching is done in equiangular fashion, I think invented by Simon Brown, meaning rather than stepping linearly, which would have looked like this, is quite noisy and in fact bad, we step in angles along the line. So, doing so steps linearly in the cookie's angular domain and important samples the inverse squared fall-off as well. But it had a couple of arithmetic and texture optimizations added. So firstly, the heterogeneous part of the effect of the fall-off remains constant throughout the march, so we just move it out of the loop. So now we're just integrating the cookie really. And secondly, to avoid cookie noise, we could use trilinear, using the step angle as well, but bilinear is twice as fast, so we simply just use the worst case MIP throughout the entire effect instead. So thirdly, given each step is a linear rotation, we can avoid all trigonometry by just computing the rotational delta once and just reusing that each time, which is nice. And yeah, that's it. We use these volume lights for orbs, warp portals, and tons of other things where like more sharpness than the other big voxel fog just wouldn't cut it. Anyway, out here we have seen these folks doing some sort of fracking and processing of this amber stuff. And basically this effect is just water without any reflections on it, just pure refraction, as well as a lot more fog and a lot more like emissive lighting coming out of it. And I might argue that emissive is probably most of the effect. This is also not the first time we've been seeing it. It's sort of endemic to this world. And up here we also have the fruit of their labor that was endemic to this world, which is these weird amber pods, which are indeed very similar to the key before we saw encased. And these have also been foreshadowed and lighting up this world. But more importantly, they look kind of nice by the way that they light up the fog here. Anyway, now we've been traveling to 3 inner worlds within this outer world, or was it the outer world? So each world, including the one we just came out of, has an ancestral protector of sorts, which just jumped into the orb to play its role. If I hadn't skipped them, this wouldn't have been the first time we're meeting these mighty guardians. During your encounter, you encounter them in these illuminated rooms, and within each one you discover the world's orbs, as well as their boss like this, doing that particular effect. So this thing, let me break it down layer by layer. This one is sinful. So starts back to neutral, and then we add this sort of like awakening statue appearance. It's done with the same shader as the cloak ability transition, but using this dark blue albedo instead of this green emissive texture the other one used. Now, as they prepare to jump into the orb, this is where it gets weird, they freeze into this material and then they dissolve into this cloud of particles. Originally, this was done with some sins. The turbulent dissolve was a geometry shader, and the actual, this was fed by a tessellation shader as well. Big no-no. Anyway, so the tessellation was simply done to ensure an equal particle size of each of the things, so that's not too complicated. I only confess to doing this because I didn't ship geometry shaders or tessellation shaders, worry not. I just wrote a CPU preprocessor to avoid having to do the hollow domain shader altogether, so that I could ensure that the mesh itself has the correct triangle density instead. Now, what about the geometry shader? What was it doing? Well, the only thing that it really needed as an input before I could just move it to the vertex shader was the triangle center. If the triangle center was present, we could just do everything in the vertex shader instead. So we can kill it. That center is put into the mesh by simply just adding the delta from each vertex to the center to the tangent of the mesh data. This is because then the engine's built-in, what's it called, skinned mesh compute shader will just animate it for us, and then it works on skinned meshes as well, and now we can just do everything in the vertex shader instead. Now, it first scales down towards the center to separate out the particles a little bit, adds a little bit of random noise to like pick them apart and make them look all noisy, and then they all each turbulently sort of like orbit around a random point at a random speed, and then they of course all orbit down towards a point. And that's that effect really. Now, out here, where are we? We've left the gray world and now we're in the sun world with its faint warm glow and cold atmosphere. The light and fog are definitely playing a bigger role here. Now, throughout the world, there's some kind of energy emanating from these spheres, for example. You see it as a light, and sometimes you see it as these ripples on the ground instead. And they hide some secrets within. Their material uses the same sort of like amber material we saw previously, but the light inside of it is just the orbs transform instead, so you can see whatever that is behind there. So I just thought this was a cute kind of reuse of the thing. Anyway, throughout the world ripples this energy on the surface. Similarly to the water shore, it's an SDF, but instead it's to these spheres instead of to a shore. Now, unlike the water shore, however, this isn't a texture. So much like forward lights or anything like that, this is just stored as a shader uniform with like a list of these things that it needs to have the distance to instead. Now, this isn't the first time that we've done stuff this way, and it won't be the last. The waves emanating on this surface are also just a uniform list of waves in the shader, and so are the little footsteps on the ground. In my opinion, it's just a nice alternative to doing like off-screen textures or something like that. Anyway, back out here, the world is heating up a little bit, so let's try to break down the light setup of this world a little bit. Now, without any fog or bespoke lighting for this world, it gets quite dark and barren. The fog itself does a great job of separating the playground from the background, but the lighting, of course, adds a bunch to it. The lighting helps with the same task. It's a baked emissive specifically for this world to give it its hot underglow. Without the fog, the glow is quite jarring. It's definitely set up in tandem with the fog, but the job it's trying to accomplish is creating this sense of like the playground is the cold stuff and the non-playground is the hot stuff. Anyway, we use this sort of baked emissive often to add area lights throughout the world, just to bake them into the indirect texture. This part, without it, it's quite jarring, so playing a big role here. And in this scene, it's just two large soft boxes, one on the left and the right side, to create this sort of like weird two cave lighting look thing. Anyway, over here, things are warming up a lot and becoming quite bright. And we're close to the end. It's lunch and we're only 15 minutes overtime, so it's good. Anyway, there's one more big component to this Worlds Within Worlds puzzle, and to check it out, we're gonna have to go for another lift ride. Things are about to get real weird over here. So, here's this weird structure which Carl, our animator, animated. It's a portal to the outer world. Golly gee. So, much like Warps, this is made using two cameras. The inner one looks like this. You can see we have these duplicated environmental assets from the other world that sort of bleed into it. Naturally, we use the same culling tricks that we have on the reflections and the warps, but just using the door frame instead here, and the same cropping trick and the same masking trick, of course. And out here, the same trick applies. Of course, we do a depth prepass for the main camera, boom, so that we don't do any double rendering before we composite the whole thing, which is neat. Anyway, bringing the worlds together, we have some use some shadowed fog as well, and a light. The sun is removed on either side with just an invisible shadow caster. And on this side of the door, of course, the door itself is shadowing the sunlight away as well. So only that one light that we place between the two worlds is the thing that spills through for extra control. And it's simply duplicated on either side of the renderer. And to make sure that the door frame shadows it, there's just these two invisible shadow casters on either side. Isn't that funny? Anyway, so right then, let's walk through. Naturally, as we pass through the portal, we do actually teleport at some frame, but you can't see when that is. Now, out here in the gray world is another boss up ahead, which we're skipping much like the others because it is, in fact, a can of worms, and I don't want to talk about it at all. Now, let's get out of here. We have one more portal to look at, and sorry if this transition is jarring. So out here, once again, a lot warmer, a lot brighter, but we don't care about that. We're going to a door. And we're back in the purple world. So that's another door. So I hate this one. There is water on the other side, so that's one more recursive camera on top of the portal. Luckily, all the culling, cropping, and masking really helps, of course. But outside, we've got this army of refractive orbs. Amazing. And there's even ripples on the floor. And wouldn't you know, we're walking across the Crystalline bridge. So this is the profiling benchmark of this game. And just to be funny, we have the mists as well over there. Just, I don't know, of course, all the expensive stuff happens to happen, just be on the same camera, why not? Anyway, as usual, I won't spoil anything, but the final puzzle over here rules. It gets really weird, I promise. Anyway, let's wrap this up. All right, our cosmic journey is nearly complete. We're done pondering, and it's time to hand over some gosh darn orbs. I think I already said it once, but spoiler warning. Let's see if it wasn't bright enough. Really good mileage out of the portal effect. Back in the desert, but where? So, up here it's quite foggy. The way that I made it look like that was by concentrating the fog very heavily in the penumbras of the shadows to really accentuate the contrast of the shadows. The orbs seem to have lined up for a final goodbye in front of our diving board, and the speaker is saying words to stall for time as the video is playing. And we seem to have come full circle. So this is the end. One last show off by our animator Carl here. No, not last. There's another one. Now, if you've seen our reveal trailer with this shot of a world within a world within a world within a, and so on. So this shot was actually born in the reveal trailer before it became our ending. And thus, I guess, was the benchmark of what the warp system had to do. Anyway, freeze frame. So as things unfold, the sun's atmosphere is shadowed by its architecture like that over there. This is done simply with a texture of the architecture, and in this case, it's not some ray-marched effect, it's the froxel fog. Well, technically, I guess that's ray-marched. Anyway. Space. So the cover is taken off of these planet representations of our world made by Nikki and lit by a shallow little spotlight. like that. And this is to get these neat little self-shadows, because of course that matters. And of course planets, I mean, they gotta have atmosphere, otherwise we're just not in space. So there it is without, there it is again. And of course they need to, I mean, the dark side of the moon needs to have some self-shadowing. So we have a cute little blob shadow that makes it dark back there. That's neat. But the fun lesson about this modeled fog, and this is the last time I'm pausing, is to exaggerate the shadow here by putting a very shallow plane of fog that's just at the penumbra intersection of the planet to really get this heavy contrast between the dark and the light side of the fog. So here it is without that plane, now it's more uniform, and here it is with again. And of course that shadow adds quite a bit. It's just a very fake shadow, there's no soft shadow in the game, actually. Anyway, that's it. I'm gonna let it play now. I'm gonna have a water break. This scene is a very good test of the temporal stability of the froxel fog. Once again, very late spoiler warning. I would like to thank my colleagues for allowing me to make a very elaborate 5 gigabyte talk. I would like to thank the Graphics Programming Conference for their patience with me bringing audio and a MacBook to their presentation stage. Thank you for making it work. Yeah, and thanks to all of you guys for listening. I think everyone's eager to get to lunch, am I right? Oh yeah? In that case, thank you for coming. You can ask me questions outside, yeah? All right.